Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Thursday, July 31st, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. How you doing?
Hi, Jessica. Good to be with you.
Glad to have you here. It is day 664 of the war. Following France and the UK, Canada now says it will recognize a Palestinian state into September. Hostage families have panned the move as shameful, while Israel is said to warn Hamas that it will annex parts of Gaza if no hostage deal is reached. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump reacted to those assertions and said that he is working on a new Gaza aid plan, and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is reportedly traveling to Israel right now. We'll talk about all of that, as well as the latest incident of Jewish settler violence in a West Bank village. It took place on Monday. Stay with us. So, Jacob, first France and then the UK and now Canada says it will recognize a Palestinian state in September. They're all obviously pushing Israel to end the war in Gaza. Hard to say where this will all go, but what are you hearing on your end?
So each of these countries is trying to take a slightly different approach to this. They all are obviously intending to recognize a Palestinian state in September at the General Assembly. But whereas France basically, I wouldn't say unconditionally, because in the months leading up to this process, they've been in very close contacts with the Palestinian Authority to try to get them to take several steps, like President Abbas announcing that there would be elections next year. I think that also condemning the October 7th attack was something that the French were really demanding. So that happened, and then we saw Macron move forward. And the UK, their track was to try to condition it a little bit more on whether or not there's a ceasefire in Gaza, whether or not Israel takes steps to annex the West Bank or Gaza, or if it, on the other hand, just moves towards a two-state solution. And if it does that latter option, then they would be considering walking back this decision to announce. Canada now is saying we're conditioning this announcement or this plan on reforms by the PA. And it's specific about holding elections next year, which I don't know how they're going to condition something on something happening next year. But my understanding is, I guess, Abbas just assured Prime Minister Carney that there will be elections. And he also talked about expecting an expectation that the future Palestinian state will be demilitarized, which is something that Abbas has said over and over again. He has no problem with that. And then that Hamas be excluded from any sort of Palestinian governance. Another thing that Abbas has no issue with. So yes, these are conditions, but it's kind of a given almost. The elections question is a little bit more tricky, but the fact that it's not happening until after this recognition is announced, I guess you could say Canada could withdraw it. But basically, this is not something that Canada is really going to be walking back at this point from now until September. I think what's interesting also is that President Trump, there seems to be this tsunami of countries, and I think we'll likely see Australia joining, and there are others in the West that are planning to as well. But he hasn't really been too critical. Basically, the White House issued a statement just saying Trump views these steps as a reward for terrorism and rewarding Hamas, which is not something he wants to do. But it avoided criticizing the countries. It didn't even mention Canada by name in the statement. And Trump, a couple days ago, basically was just saying they have a right to their opinion. I'm not going to try to convince them otherwise, almost. I think there might have been some expectations amongst Israelis that there would be pressure from the Trump administration against countries, maybe threatening all sorts of U.S. economic benefits in exchange to make sure that they don't take this step. You even saw the Biden administration leaning on countries not to do this. But we're not seeing that from the Trump administration, which is really interesting. I think they were willing to sanction the ICC because it had to do with the U.S., because the U.S. was also at risk of being coming under charges from the ICC. So that was not something they wanted to see happen, and they were happily willing to sanction the ICC as they did in the first term. But as in terms of countries that are recognizing a Palestinian state, we're not seeing U.S. sanctions, and there's nothing even about it. And if it was even to come at the congressional level, and we can talk about this in a second, but there's not clear, overwhelming bipartisan support of Israel right now as this war drags on.
So just before we get to Congress, do you think there's a sense here that countries are doing this in order that they will still go through with this move in September, even if the war were to end, even if Israel were to pull back and to move forward on a ceasefire and to move forward on flooding Gaza with aid. Where are you, like, what kind of reactions are you seeing to those thoughts and ideas?
That's a good question. I think that each country is a unique case. And the fact that the UK actually one of the conditions was if Israel, you agree to secure a ceasefire, then we'll be willing to hold off on this announcement. But their other condition was moving towards a two-state solution, which Israel's really not, at least in this current government, interested in all doing. So given that those are the conditions for the UK, and that the other countries don't talk about conditioning it, and actually basically what the Canadian Prime Minister says is that we would have liked to see this happen through peace talks, but we just understand that that hasn't panned out. And therefore, we feel that this is principally the right decision to make. But I do think you're right. It comes against the backdrop of real frustration with Israel's handling of this war. And despite Hamas's foot dragging and playing hardball at the negotiation table, despite all that, that's how bad Israel's situation is right now, that still Israel's seen as the problematic party here, given the scenes coming out with the children who are clearly very severely malnourished and the humanitarian crisis more broadly. That the countries are blaming because they see Israel as the one really in control of Gaza at this point, given that you're talking about 75% of the territory being occupied. They're not blaming Hamas anymore for this war dragging on, and they are at least holding Israel to a higher standard.
Okay, let's move this to something that you were covering last night, a vote in the U.S. Senate rejecting a pair of resolutions that were introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders aimed at blocking an arms sale to Israel. So you had a majority of Democrats voting against this weapons transfers for the first time. And if you set that against what we're seeing in these other countries, what's your take on that? What's your take on the vote?
Yeah, it's an extension of this real lack of trust. If you think about it, also the three countries, Macron is considered a centrist party, but definitely the UK and Canada, they're led by liberal parties right now, and Labour and the Liberal Party. And the Democrats obviously are a bit more in that camp. So it makes sense that there's a similar feeling of distrust with this Netanyahu government. And the fact that the previous resolution that Sanders is bringing, these resolutions, Bernie Sanders, progressive senator, has been trying to stop arms sales to Israel throughout the war. And he's done this several times. And each time, there's no chance they're going to pass because you have a slight Republican majority in the Senate, the unanimous, basically against. There's Rand Paul that sometimes plays a bit of a spoiler for the GOP, but generally you have the Republican Party that's in lockstep with Israel, and a law for until now you had all you even needed was a couple of Democrats theoretically, but you have had until now a majority of them, and that is now shifting. From the last vote, we saw 15 Democrats trying to block weapons sales, and now we have 27 compared to 17 Democrats who voted in favor of the weapons sale. So it was a 27-17 vote amongst Democrats. I think the final votes was like 70 in favor, so the resolution went through or was voted down. But basically, we're seeing this very quick shift from April, this last time when it was just 15, to now to Wednesday night when we're at 27. So clearly, I think what's happened between April and July, the ceasefire talks the ceasefire had already broken down, but we saw really the humanitarian crisis balloon, because during that time, Israel blockaded the Strip and didn't allow any aid in for 78 days, and that's kind of spurred a lot of the scenes that we're seeing. And the similar lack of trust in Netanyahu that is felt in the UK, France, and Canada, and probably other countries, is felt in the Democratic parties. What I would note also is that while the Republicans were on this vote unanimous, I believe. Maybe I missed one vote against, but I don't think those numbers would be the same in the House. And I think that's worth noting, that there's a small segment of the party, it's Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tom Massey and others, who are incredibly critical of Israel. And Marjorie Taylor Greene even described Israel's war in Gaza as a genocide, the first Republican to do that this week. And that's showing a real shift in the party. And is strong. It shows that I think the sentiment that Israel's dealing with is it's not only a Democratic problem at this point, it's growing amongst even Trump's base.
Right. Okay. Let's take a quick break. And when we're back, let's talk a little bit more about this. Some of President Trump's reactions, Steve Witkoff coming to the region, and statements that are being made in the Israeli government about what it is looking to do in Gaza. So stay with us. Okay, so you mentioned before the break how President Trump didn't react all that strongly to these statements about countries regarding their statements regarding a Palestinian state in September. But you have these other comments that are coming out from, or other notes that are coming out from Israel's government about possibly annexing parts of Gaza. And as you have noted in your reporting from yesterday, Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy, is coming to the region, coming to Israel. Where do you think that puts all of this? What's the conversations that we're anticipating him having with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu?
So interestingly, in Trump's statement regarding the Canadian decision, he said we think it's rewarding Hamas, and President Trump is focused on trying to feed Gaza. So that seems to be a top of mind. He didn't even mention actually in that statement the hostages, which I think is another reason why Steve Witkoff is coming to the region.
To say that he's still focused on this.
Correct. They're definitely still focused on it, even though if you do recall, the last time Trump's spoken a lot about it, he's basically said, I don't think these talks can go anywhere because Hamas, when you get down to the last hostages, they're not going to be willing to release them. So it seems like for now, front of mind is the aid issue. And while Trump was in Scotland on Monday, he talked about something that turned a lot of heads in Israel, that he's going to be pushing to establish new food centers, as he called it, in Gaza, due to the scenes that he argues demonstrate that there is growing starvation amongst children and others. And he didn't give a lot of details, but he said that these centers are not going to have fences. He was fixated on the fences, that he said that people saw aid or that was sitting there 30 meters away and that they couldn't get to it because there are fences there. It's not really, to be honest, I'm not really sure what he's talking about, but he's talking about new food centers. And when reporters asked him about it the next day, he said, yeah, well, Israel's going to be in charge of running these food centers. Now, I spoke with people at the Israeli embassy and in Jerusalem. They don't really know what he is talking about. Initially, there was thoughts maybe there's an idea to expand the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and make new distribution sites, because right now there's just basically 3 operating. There's supposed to be 4, but one of them hasn't really been operating. So for the whole Gaza Strip, that's one of the problems with GHF, is that it's just been so few sites. So maybe we make more. So maybe that's what Trump is talking about. The White House issued a statement a few hours after, when the reporters kept asking questions saying, what is this new plan? And they basically said, well, details are coming. I don't know. I think that my best bet would be, again, this possibly additional GHF sites, but I think a lot of increasingly people are feeling that GHF project was a bit of a failure. So
why put more into that? Right.
Why put more into that? Israel's now, the steps that it took over the weekend to allow more aid in is actually to shift the balance away from GHF to back towards the UN, and getting more trucks in through the UN and other outlets. So whatever Trump's talking about, I don't know how it will drive with that. It's been, I think, a lot of this back and forth in the way that Trump has described various initiatives that he's had. If it's not aid, it's the Gaza relocation idea, that now he basically says, well, a lot of people liked it and a lot of people didn't like it, but we're not going to deal with that right now, was what he said on Tuesday. And then from, I believe, the end of June, he had been saying that we were a week away from a hostage deal. And each week he would say, actually, it'll be okay, it's a week away, and insisting that it was a week away. And then now all of a sudden he's like, well, actually, the whole time I knew that this was never going to work out. He said, I told you and you and you. He pointed to different reporters a few days ago and said, you heard me. I said that this was never going to happen because when you get down to the last hostages. So it's a little bit hard to follow Trump. It kind of feels like I'm covering Joe Biden again, in terms of if you try to nitpick at every word, whether it's a grand plan behind it, I'm not really sure. But there is clear a prioritization at this point of the issue of aid. And I think that will be something that Steve Witkoff talks about when as he lands in Israel on Thursday, for meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior Israeli officials.
And let's talk about the annexation talk, so to speak, that we keep on hearing mentioned and not really described in any kind of detail. It's thrown out there as a threat to Hamas, of course. What are your sources saying about this? Are they reacting to it at all?
So the U.S. has not reacted publicly. Privately, I think they're still trying to adjudicate the idea. There's been some leaking from prominent Israeli reporters who say that the U.S. has given a green light to allow Israel to move forward with that. My understanding, speaking with U.S. officials, is that that's not the case yet. I think it's it seems like a bizarre strategy because the same argument about land and that's what really Hamas cares about. That was the argument that was made for the past few months when Israel advanced this Operations Gideon's Chariots, where they're talking about let's take over more and more land, and then we'll get to 75% of the land, and then once we're occupying that much, then Hamas will agree to give up the hostages. That didn't move the needle, and Israel's standing in the international community has plummeted since because I think what they were trying to do simultaneously was just not allow aid into Gaza. They also felt like that would be something that would bring Hamas to collapse, and that was proven not to be the case when Hamas was just saying over and over again that they want an end to the war, and that's the way to get the hostages out. And Israel doesn't want to take that route to get there. So now they're trying this annexation, and the idea, I guess, is maybe we first start with the perimeter, the outer edge of the Gaza Strip, where we've already basically taken over, and we'll formally annex that. But that was, as Tal mentioned on the podcast yesterday, it's almost irreversible to do that. And if it's just a pressure tactic, that's one thing. But if it's actually just about expanding more land, which is, I think, not what Israel wants to be seen in the international community is doing, is making this war about land and not about dismantling Hamas or getting the hostages out. It seems like a confusing strategy to go about it. But the more days go by, the more and more the Israeli officials seem to be talking about it. And it'll be interesting to see how Steve Witkoff decides whether or not he's comfortable with Israel taking that step.
Right. One would imagine. Okay, finally, let's just touch on one more subject, and that is settler violence, Jewish settler violence, extreme violence that took place on Monday. Inon Levy, a sanctioned settler who allegedly shot dead a Palestinian activist, a prominent Palestinian activist who was featured by chance in the Oscar-winning documentary No Other Land. And that was during a confrontation on Monday. Inon Levy is now on house arrest. What else are you hearing about this?
Right. So this incident took place on Monday, and basically there are competing claims of what exactly happened, but what both sides agree is that Yunon Levy shot dead Auda Hathalin, a 31-year-old activist in this Oscar-winning movie, as you mentioned. And what's the question is what led up to the shooting. Levy argues that he was acting in self-defense and that came under, I wouldn't say fire, but that people were throwing rocks at him, Palestinians. The Palestinians say that he had been dismantling various property on their land and that he had been the one to get violent first, and they tried to push him off to prevent him from, I think, dismantling a well or other infrastructure at the site. And that he was way too quick to use lethal force against them when they were unarmed at the time. What's been interesting to see what's unfolded since is the differences in how Levy has been treated compared to the growing number of Palestinian suspects that have been arrested. Whereas at the scene, you had, I believe, there were about 4 Palestinians who were arrested and unsuspected of stone throwing at Levy, whereas Levy was arrested for shooting and killing someone. But whereas the Palestinians were given, I think they were left at a military base for 13 hours. They were handcuffed and had their feet shackled and weren't able to move. Levy was transferred to a police station and released the next day because the difference in the West Bank is that Israeli settlers are under Israeli civilian law, and that therefore they're able to see a judge within 24 hours for a hearing. And Palestinians are under Israeli military law, and that therefore they only can see Israeli authorities can wait 96 hours until they bring a Palestinian before a judge. So we saw on Tuesday, Levy brought before a judge the Jerusalem Magistrates Court, so inside Israel proper, and given a hearing, and he was released to house arrest despite the very severe charges. Whereas the the 4 Palestinians had to wait until Tuesday for their hearing, and they were given an 8-day remand extension compared to Levy. So they're going to be still in jail by the time he's even released from house arrest. So there's a real difference in, I think it highlights the differences in the military and the civilian system that different Israelis and Palestinians are under in the West Bank. And I think based off of how these cases typically go, it would be likely to see that Levy will be either released for the slap on his wrist or given a much lesser charge, given the way that this government and the authorities in Israel have been treating this issue.
And treating settler violence. So I think we're going to end our podcast there. Jacob, thanks for all the updates and the highlights of what's been going on your beats.
Thanks, Jessica.
Sure. And thanks to you for listening to the Times Visual's Daily Briefing, and stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care, be well. Talk to you soon.